Welcome to Oppenheimer, Science, Mission, Legacy. Oppenheimer's story is of significant challenges, outstanding accomplishments, and the beginning of what we call big science. It is also an important story that continues to influence our scientists today.
Was he a hero? Yes, I think he deserves that title. But like all heroes throughout history, he was a flawed hero.
You had the drive of wartime urgency. The laboratory under his leadership responded to that.
They came to a design. It was pretty novel and pretty innovative. And because they weren't actually sure it was going to work, they needed to do a test.
And when he's in the bunker at Trinity, he's clinging to a post, shaking, because it's all come down to this moment. It succeeded, but it cost him.
Fat man, little boy, they were not weapons of deterrence. They were weapons to end a great conflict.
We begin our story by exploring Oppenheimer's contributions to science. But first, who was J. Robert Oppenheimer?
I think one of the most interesting historical aspects about Oppenheimer is his complexity. And over time, I've sort of tried to divide that complexity up a bit so I can understand it. So I have him as a pre-war character, as a wartime character, and as a post-war character. And you see pre-war, you see a precocious individual, somebody who is brilliant even as a child, who does not have a normal childhood. He himself said that he had no normal way of being a normal bastard like other kids. He just didn't have that kind of lifestyle.
I think both Robert and Frank and the family just really had a natural interest in how things are. Where does this, not to get a good grade or to go through school at a certain level, but just absolute fundamental interest. I think in the family I heard about his rock collecting, sparking his interest in science, and I love that. It's just such a, interest in rocks. Where did this come from? And why do we have rocks? And what is the earth like? Then led into geology and chemistry and physics just through a natural exploration of what interested him. And he was, he was gifted and different, and like he was in a situation where that was okay and he could pursue it.
Go ahead, please.
J. Robert Oppenheimer is one of those characters cast in a movie of high drama. He was an unusually gifted, unusually intelligent young child. He was the child of Jewish parents. His mother was a native-born American. His father had come to America from Germany and had made quite a bit of money.
He started his career during the Depression. He could see a lot of people around him who were struggling. Then the war came, and then ultimately Pearl Harbor and becoming part of the war itself. Those must have been very complex issues for the academic community, for individuals.
He was the chosen one. He was so bright, so gifted, so entertaining that his parents indulged in virtually anything that he wanted.
Oppenheimer's early years were spent studying abroad, and his early accomplishments have influenced today's scientific community. However, when it came to science, he was truly ahead of his time.
Astrophysical objects and the structure of astrophysical objects under extreme conditions, particularly conditions like black holes, quasars, and the like, are of fundamental concern today. And Oppenheimer was one of the very first to predict the continuation of gravitational collapse back in the 1930s. In the opinion of many prominent theoretical physicists like Hans Bethe and several others, was that he might well have won the Nobel Prize for those endeavors, but they were quite far ahead of their time. And even when I was in school in the 1980s and 1990s, black holes were recognized to be a theoretical object, but were not yet recognized as being something that exists in the real world. Now, not only is it known that they exist in the real world, they exist in profusion in the real world. And so that's a linkage directly between some of Oppenheimer's first work on theoretical physics and current problems today.
A lot of the same kinds of scientific thought And same kinds of processes are important for particularly high energy astrophysics or supernova astrophysics that are important in nuclear weapons. People who work on supernovae and nucleosynthesis, they deal with very energetic systems, they deal with nuclear processes, they deal with complex fluid motion, complex hydrodynamics, and a lot of those can play an important role in understanding our nuclear weapon systems too.
Oppenheimer made a number of scientific contributions. Certainly in my own field of condensed matter physics, he's famous for something called the Born-Oppenheimer approximation. It goes to how we think about how electrons and phonons interact in solids. He also made a number of similar contributions in nuclear physics and nuclear science.
The field of theoretical physics was evolving in Europe. Oppenheimer gravitated toward theory and played a significant role in establishing the American School of Theoretical Physics, which gained prominence in the 1930s. He was a brilliant advocate.
In the 1920s, physics was much more of a club. There were very few physicists actually in the entire world. The famous 1927 Solvay conference, I don't know, it had maybe 30 physicists altogether. Then these were the leading physicists of their time.
And he happened to be in Germany at exactly the right moment when theoretical physics was taking an enormous leap. It was as if somebody had opened the door to a magic room and suddenly the human mind was able to understand physics.
I think the work that the best theoretical physicists do is develop an intuitive intuition for how things work. They can take a limited set of data, a set of known observations, and at the chalkboard level, sketch the underlying phenomenology that's being explained. That ability to derive an insight, to say, I get it, this is this phenomena, here are its basic properties. When that happens, that's a pretty special moment in time. I think those moments happened early in the days before the Manhattan Project, where the leading scientists of the world, including Oppenheimer, knew this was pretty special, had both an understanding of the phenomena and knew its consequences. And that was probably an element of the origins of the Manhattan Project.
When he came back and joined the academic community here in the United States, one of the things that I think weighed on his mind was, how do we make American universities at the same sort of quality scale as what he experienced as a student in Europe?
What his major contribution was before Los Alamos, it was establishing in America and on the West Coast America's leading school of theoretical physics. It was, by the time of the start of World War II, the center of theoretical physics for the world.
Today at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, scientists continue pondering the natural world as they explore the power of the universe.
Certainly the laboratory has made singular contributions. There are individuals who've just had amazing ideas in that redefined fields. But the bulk of what we do really is the scientists of the laboratory with their collaborators coming together in a teaming way to solve big problems. That's a feature of Los Alamos science. I think that's a feature that was first created, first envisioned in the Manhattan Project due to Oppenheimer's leadership.
What we do really is we're kind of integrators across a lot of different fields of study in the laboratory, where I need to take assessments from maybe people doing work in high explosives research. There's people who are doing work fielding experiments with those high explosives. There's other people developing models, how we numerically conceptualize what's going on with the high explosives. We're working with lots of different teams and different groups of people across the laboratory. And that can be really rewarding because you realize the depth of knowledge that all these different people have is really impressive. It's really substantial.
In my mind, the importance of what this laboratory does for the nation and for the world is as great today as any time in its history. And I think that the kind of environment, the kind of attitude toward questioning that Oppenheimer put in place is going to continue to serve us as we tackle problems that may be harder than any we've had to tackle in the past. And I suspect that their solutions will be needed urgently.
Was J. Robert Oppenheimer a genius? He likely was, and in various ways. His brilliance included not only his understanding of science, but in his teaching method and his ability to lead other scientists in fields he was not familiar with. All these attributes will come into play as he becomes the first director of Project Y in Los Alamos, New Mexico, an integral part of the Manhattan Project.
I don't think Oppenheimer ever took an IQ test. If he did, he would have aced it. But I think the way you understand his intelligence is by the rapidity of his mind. But probably the quality that stood out most for individuals was a quicksilver mind. His ability to listen to different threads of an argument coming from different directions and different disciplines, pull them together, assess their meaning, and come up with a synthesis that everybody that turned and listened at the end of it would say, "Of course."
I had the opportunity to talk with Kai Bird, co-author of American Prometheus, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Oppenheimer.
He was painfully aware of his own intelligence, and I think at a young age didn't know how to funnel it. There's a story in the book of him turning to a classmate at the ethical culture school and telling this young girl at the age of 10 or something, well, ask me a question in Latin and I'll answer you in Greek. So he often came off with, well into his 20s as a young man who was a little strange and arrogant and full of himself. But as I said, he had a sort of fragile psychological personality. He was socially awkward.
Fission was discovered in Nazi Germany in 1938. Months after this discovery, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, starting World War II in Europe.
Fission was enormously earth-shaking in the fact that an atomic bomb was readily apparent. There was just no question that if you split enough atoms, you would release an enormous amount of energy. And in fact, Robert Serber tells a story of walking into Oppenheimer's Berkeley office and finding a crude sketch of an atomic bomb on his blackboard. So it was known immediately by almost all physicists that somehow this was very possible.
At the heart of the atomic bomb is this profound realm of science.
The 1930s were a unique confluence of rapid experimentation and knowledge acquisition in the sciences, and a continuous and alarming darkening of the world from a political perspective.
The United States had not been an active combatant in World War II, but that changed on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. American scientists would now go to war.
Up until about 1941, certainly December of 1941, the United States had no interest in going to war.
As we approach towards 1941, and then the U.S. being drawn into war, all of a sudden work on this mysterious weapons intensifies. More of his colleagues are disappearing. He knows where they're going. He knows that it's somehow related to this bomb. He wanted to be a part of it. And one of the characteristics that I think is sometimes underplayed about him, he was ambitious. He really did want to make a significant contribution. That was important to him. And he saw, with now America in the war, and with the possibility of a weapon that could be used against our country, he saw this as a central threat.
Today, laboratory scientists continue exploring complex nuclear phenomena to improve the present U.S. nuclear weapon deterrent.
Fortunately, we've not used a nuclear weapon or an atomic bomb in anger since World War II and the Manhattan Project. But the existence of our stockpile has led to world stability. Countries have chosen not to behave in inappropriate ways because of the threat of nuclear weapons. And so the current nuclear stockpile plays an important role in national and international security, even though we haven't used them.
In the fall of 1942, Oppenheimer was introduced to General Leslie Groves, the commander of the Manhattan Project. This meeting would change Oppenheimer's life, and it would also change the world forever.
When the laboratory, a secret laboratory, became a possibility, he wanted to be the man to direct it. The man who was going to make the choice was General Leslie Groves, the director of the Manhattan Project, who Oppenheimer had met earlier and had very carefully courted. Oppenheimer told his wife, "I am courting him like a girlfriend." As the war neared and then Pearl Harbor occurred, all of a sudden security, particularly regarding government work related to defense, the levels of security and the demands of security rose. The interesting thing about General Groves is that the more time he spent with Oppenheimer, he saw him as the man to lead the laboratory. His ability not just to understand chemistry and metallurgy and physics and all the other dynamics involved in fission research, he knew all the major players. He knew everybody who was anybody in science, just including all of the European refugees. It made sense.
Oppenheimer was essential in convincing General Groves to build his secret weapons laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. As 1943 began, this beautiful mesa top would become home to some of the world's most brilliant scientists.
New Mexico is one of those themes in Oppenheimer's life that people probably don't pay as much attention to. When the war came and the Manhattan Project began and the necessity of finding an isolated laboratory for work on the atomic bomb, when that issue arose, Oppenheimer remembered Los Alamos. Many places for the laboratory were considered. So for better or worse, Oppenheimer is not just the father of the laboratory, but the man who brought the laboratory to Los Alamos Mesa.
So when General Groves tapped him to lead the lab, it looks to me like he sort of said, well, now I have to do that same thing, creating quality in a project that's never existed before, in a setting, that's a laboratory that's never existed before. And I think wisely, Groves gave Oppenheimer a relatively free hand to do that.
The scientific workforce, right, that they had, the initial people that they were trying to recruit, a lot of them came from more cosmopolitan cities, they came from university settings, and they were just sort of dropped into New Mexico. But when you read the oral histories and the accounts of the workers who were here, a lot of people just really talk about they loved being out west, they loved their little tiny bit of free time they had. They could go hiking, they could go skiing. For them, I mean, it was war. It was wartime conditions, and they had to work hard. But it was just a really, to them, it was like a magical experience. You know, if you think about it, you lived in the East Coast, you'd never been out west, and then all of a sudden, here you are in New Mexico, in 1944, 1943. Think about that. It would have been almost life-changing, really.
Oppenheimer was born in 1904 in New York City. Coming from a family of privilege, he was able to travel to the West on many occasions in his youth. He loved to visit northern New Mexico and soon purchased a cabin in the Sangre de Cristos just outside Santa Fe. He fell in love with the terrain, history, and the people of the region. He would create his laboratory here and be inspired by the land he had come to love.
His father sent him off as a teenager one summer to New Mexico. Accompanied by a teacher. And Robert fell in love with New Mexico and the high plains and horseback riding. And, so much so that later in life he told his younger brother Frank that his ambition in life was somehow to combine his love of physics with his love of New Mexico. Well, he did. He succeeded fantastically in doing this.
Interestingly, New Mexico was a place that was burned into his heart. For an intellectual, a big city intellectual, like an urban child, it seems almost like a contradiction. And yet when he came here and he dressed in his jeans, and his riding outfits, and his boots, and his pork pie hat, this was where he belonged. I don't think California, for all of its charms for him, or Princeton, which is later where he spent the rest of his public life, they never really had the same kind of meaning. They were places he lived, where he worked, which he enjoyed, but they weren't New Mexico. New Mexico was the place in his heart.
By 1943, World War II had taken millions of lives all over the globe. Oppenheimer's challenge was leading top scientists to quickly manufacture and develop an atomic weapon to help end an increasingly deadly war.
The collection of minds that was present on top of this mesa in those 2 years in the 1940s was truly remarkable. There really has not been a collection of scientific minds like that, to my knowledge, anywhere since that time. The Manhattan Project made physics and science in general an object of concern for governments because of its practical application, right? And so that was actually something that was entirely new and entirely unique.
The fact that he could bring together not only the country's but the world's best scientists to build a team to pull off what they pulled off in just a couple-year period, I think that speaks more to, let's call it, Oppenheimer's secret sauce than any particular technical contribution. The body of work that got accomplished here in Los Alamos in a very short period of time, going from underlying physics we didn't understand to actually producing a product, a device that worked, that's pretty amazing. And I think Oppenheimer, as a leader, as well as a scientist, deserves a lot of credit for those contributions.
But I mean, you just think of some of the greats in 20th century physics and mathematics. You had Fermi here. You had very young physicists like Feynman, who was going to go on to demonstrate his greatness. You had people like Bethe here. He was able to attract Johnny von Neumann, one of the truly great mathematical minds of the 20th century. And I think that was part of what his vision was, of creating a place where the physics in the United States would rival anything in the world. But then that's what he needed to be able to accomplish what he did in the Manhattan Project.
Oppenheimer's scientific legacy remains very much a part of this laboratory, and today's scientists face significant challenges and are solving big problems only this laboratory can solve. The concept of big science is rooted in Oppenheimer's mission, and big science continues.
We do big science, and we always have. And that was why the laboratory was formed in the early 1940s, was to do the science needed in order to develop the atomic bomb. And that is still the type of work that we do, right? We still specialize in science that's too big to be handled by other institutions, that's a high risk, high reward, that requires the skills of many, many people and requires integrated interdisciplinary teams to realize a common goal.
He's the man that does change the world. It changes how we think about politics, international relations, and diplomacy, even today.
He was a great teacher of theoretical physics. And if Niels Bohr was the father of the quantum, Oppenheimer was the prophet and the educator. He's just one of the most intelligent men of the 20th century. And when I say intelligent, I mean in a very human sense. Not that he was just quantum physicist, but that he was a gentle human being who was a philosopher. And that's a rare thing and a fascinating thing. How do you hold those two strands of human thought in one head? And Oppenheimer was that. He was constantly curious about the physical world and yet constantly thinking about the consequences of science. And he was a gentle soul.
It's this superb talent that we're able to bring together in an environment that allows one mind to sharpen another and create results that just don't happen anywhere else. And what Oppenheimer did with the team that he brought together was he created results that fundamentally changed the world.
In our core nuclear weapons mission, we continue to steward the nuclear stockpile that is the legacy of the Manhattan Project. So the challenge for science is to have as much confidence that our weapons are going to work. Our confidence has to derive from science being brought together in various ways to still have that confidence without using our product for an intended purpose.
If theoretical physics is in fact the answer to the universe's secrets, then he's a man of the secrets of the universe. I would hope that what people would take away is that this place at that time developed something that gave a gift to men, and like all gifts, the Greek notion, every gift from the gods has two sides. Beware what you ask for. So it was a weapon that would end the war and all wars, but it would mean more than that. It's the more than that I hope people understand. It isn't just about bombs and airplanes and wars. In the very end, and I'm sure this is how 100 and 200 and 500 and 1,000 years from now, we will be looking back at this as an exercise of the mind. And despite all the magnificent discoveries of 1,000 years from now, for all the cures for all diseases, all the new kinds of energies, the men and women of tomorrow will look back at this place and this time and these men and women, and they will think, I'm envious.
Oppenheimer helped establish the American School of Theoretical Physics after receiving a world-class European education. He helped set the stage for partnerships between government, academia, and industry on a truly unprecedented scale. By the early 1940s, World War II had become a deadly global war with no end in sight. And on this mesa, in 1943, Oppenheimer's team began their work. The task was monumental, and the race for an atomic bomb intensified. The initial approach taken by the scientists was to use a gun-type assembly, which involves firing a subcritical mass of material at another subcritical mass using explosives. This was going to be a new weapon, and the scientists working at Los Alamos had to develop innovative solutions.
Originally, they really thought they could use one method of assembly, the gun-assembled method, right, for two different weapons, one using uranium, fissile uranium, and one using fissile plutonium.
It wasn't clear there was going to be enough uranium for an atomic bomb. But there was also plutonium, which in effect was a much better bomb material. But it turns out that plutonium could not at that time be made pure enough to prevent a premature explosion.
In conjunction with the research on the gun-assembled method, they were already starting a little bit of implosion research.
In mid-1944, there was a crisis. The scientists realized that plutonium was not suitable for a gun-type nuclear weapon. Oppenheimer's leadership is about to be put to the test.
The crisis of '44 was a significant challenge. They not only had to develop a completely different weapon design, right, the implosion method, but they had other problems. It was a really complicated design.
And so Oppenheimer had to decide, what am I going to do? I've got a uranium shortage, and I've got a method of shooting plutonium that's not going to work. What do I do? But Oppenheimer had the courage to say, we're going to stop, recalibrate, and move forward along a different line. But he kept both lines of research going, and so ultimately we have both a gun gadget, little boy, and an implosion weapon, Fat Man.
This laboratory lives in the shadow of Oppenheimer's ghost. He encouraged that you had to always be open to debate. You had to challenge things when you didn't think it was right. You had to go find the truth from nature through experiments, through theory, through debate. That important feature that Oppenheimer left this lab of, find the truth.
Certainly the academic approach to science that Oppenheimer brought on behalf of the University of California is both formally and informally part of our culture. We're relatively more science-centric than a number of our peer national labs. And we take on big challenges. We took on a big challenge in the Manhattan Project, but we're still taking on big challenges today. We're solving the world's hardest, biggest problems that nobody else can do. So it's another example of attributes of the Manhattan Project culture created by Oppenheimer that still persist in today's Los Alamos National Laboratory.
One of the things that struck me is that he would have regular meetings, I think they were weekly meetings, with his grad students. So he hadn't managed much, but he, like all professors, he'd had a few grad students. And what I see in that record, the skill to ask questions that were just the questions that were needed to be able to help the students move their research forward. It looks to me like his ability to ask questions was central to his management style. And it appears that he had the ability to ask the questions that would move the research forward.
As a leader, he was also remarkably insightful in terms of how he led this laboratory, how he dealt with a collection of vibrant personalities, and how he managed to weld them into a cohesive team and direct a complicated set of interlocking efforts to a very pragmatic and practical solution in an intensely short period of time.
Best example of where what began here ended up in another great American success, and that's the moon effort. Started here, put 2 men on the moon in 1969. That is one of Oppenheimer's greatest legacies. It's also one of the Los Alamos Laboratory's greatest legacies.
To this day, Los Alamos National Laboratory remains at the forefront of national security science.
Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project had a very singular focus, building a bomb to end the war. But that nuclear security mission, which was trying to translate what at the time was actually very recent scientific discoveries into a new capability in service of national security, in a way, that's what we do today. Translating those very recent innovative scientific discoveries in something that can meaningfully contribute to national priorities.
LANL's an amazing place where an awful lot of knowledge and varieties of expertise come together. There's just everything here in order to understand nuclear. This lab is still very important for national security.
Solving complex problems takes a large breadth of skills. People that come from different backgrounds, educations, that work together to answer the questions for a specific problem. As time goes by, our simulations become more complex that bring us from the Manhattan Project, where the predictions were one-dimensional predictions and simulations, to nowadays, where we can do three-dimensional simulations, leveraging the increase of the computational powers that we have access to.
The people of the laboratories are very much aware of the ethical complexity of what they do. At the end of the day, if it were possible to somehow uninvent them, we would probably all stand up and cheer. But it's not. Freeman Dyson may have captured this as well as anybody by saying that we have to learn to live with these systems responsibly and quietly, possibly for a very long time. I think that's sort of the ethical problem we face. How do we live with them responsibly and quietly?
Oppenheimer changed the focus of the laboratory to develop an imploding weapon. However, the scientists also had to design fire sets, detonators, detonating circuits, and an endless number of additional parts. Again, these changes were informed by theoretical considerations and required precision engineering and intense experimentation to validate.
So the implosion method was a lot more complicated than the gun method, and they had to develop new technologies. They had to essentially create a sphere of high explosive lenses that, when they were simultaneously detonated, would direct an inward blast of energy to compress a subcritical mass of plutonium. All of this had to be done very quickly, had to be done with perfect symmetry. And all of these little pieces that had to come together had to be developed.
The fundamental ideas were pretty well worked out in the physics, but a lot of the complexity lay in the engineering. And if you think about it, that was not Oppenheimer's long suit. But still, he managed to create an environment where both the physicists and the engineers and physicists playing engineers could all figure out those problems. I would say one of his geniuses, again, was how do you point people in the right direction, that you can solve problems quickly and do what needs to be done and then get the results.
I had the chance to talk with Kai Bird, co-author of American Prometheus, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer.
Oppenheimer would walk into a meeting and he would stand at the back of the room, not at the front, and he would just listen, smoking his pipe or taking a drag on a cigarette. And he would let all the scientists argue about the way forward. And, these are men with large egos. But Oppenheimer had the ability to let them argue, and then he would intervene at exactly the right moment and summarize what everyone was saying and sort of point the way forward, the next step, to explore experimentally what should be done. And everyone would nod their head and say, okay, that's it. And he also managed to convey, I think, his sense of excitement about what was being done here, the importance. And so again, he had an enormous sort of patience and understanding about human psychology that I think made him a good leader.
Oppenheimer successfully managed many moving parts, all running together simultaneously under great scrutiny and pressure while fulfilling his mission.
I often think what it must have been like to have been Oppenheimer in those early days and months, following him. Carr is following when he drove somewhere. I'm sitting in the house that he lived in. There was a fence around here. There were security guards around his house every single day. The telephone was bugged. Everybody was watching him all the time. Reports were coming to Groves. They were going to Hoover. The FBI was in on it. But the man himself, it must have come for him that balance, the thrill of the work, the promise of delivering something that would save the world with this personal cost. That balance must have shifted every single day. And there must have been moments when he would have wondered, is this worth it all?
One of the things I find really interesting is that Oppenheimer was under constant surveillance during the war by Army security forces. But in focusing on Oppenheimer as a security threat or a potential security threat, people like David Greenglass, Ted Hall, and even Klaus Fuchs were ignored. And so they had free reign of Los Alamos. Nobody was watching them, the real spies. But we're focused on Oppenheimer, who was not a spy. You become so focused on one individual as a problem that you miss what's going on around him. And that was certainly true here at Los Alamos.
You think about it, July 16th, Trinity is successfully detonated. August 6th, Little Boy is detonated over Hiroshima. August 9th, Fat Man is detonated over Nagasaki. They didn't just successfully test Trinity and then go, oh, how are we gonna get it over there? What kind of airplane should we use? Is it gonna fit in like a combat unit? How is that gonna drop? Can we detonate it from the aircraft? Do we have to use something else to do that? What are our fail-safes? How many people do we need over in the Pacific to even assemble like the lens systems, right? So all of this logistics, the logistics for delivery, is actually called Project Alberta. And this has been going on in parallel with all of this work that's being done in Los Alamos by Los Alamos people, supervised by Oppenheimer. The other thing that Oppenheimer was managing was the supply side of the whole project. So not just the delivery to the Pacific or the test of Trinity, right, and the final design work, but how do we get all these supplies here that we need? And it was a huge challenge.
One of the laboratory's most significant accomplishments was developing and testing the world's first nuclear device. On July 16, 1945, a prototype implosion assembly was successfully detonated in what is known as the Trinity test.
Everyone who's contributed a little piece of technology to the Fat Man design, to the Trinity gadget, is sitting down there hoping that their contribution is going to work. So tensions were high. This is the proof test, right? That the Fat Man, which is already, planned for delivery, this is the proof test to reassure everyone that these weapons, that the implosion method is really going to work.
He is down at Trinity. He's watching it being assembled on a Friday afternoon. He's just recovered from a case of the chicken pox. He's down to 105 or 110 pounds, and he never was a fat man. He's smoking continually. And when he's in the bunker at Trinity, he's clinging to a post, shaking, because it's all come down to this moment. It succeeded, but it cost him. And I don't think that in the subsequent years, however much he enjoyed them and the fame and the notoriety, I think there was always that. Like he was, standing on a podium with people applauding, but taped to his leg was this ball of emotional cost.
It's truly remarkable how much scientific progress was made during the Manhattan Project. From a fairly basic understanding of nuclear fission, just in a couple years' time, that understanding allowed devices like Trinity to be not only designed, but engineered and produced, and led to the end of World War II. Back then, they kind of lived in a pretty dirt-filled town, and they had the total quantity of the laboratory's plutonium, which was measured in milligrams. And so the fact that they could make the progress they made with such a limited understanding and a limited set of tools is really quite remarkable.
Even today, these early weapons tests give our scientists and engineers great insight into nuclear phenomena.
There's still learning that we can do today with our new weapons designer, our new scientists. There's still learning available for them if they go and they study the Trinity test. There are important lessons in how to approach scientific problems when you're dealing with unknown unknowns that are still learnable from Trinity. We can see how other very great minds attacked that problem, and it's a useful way for us to create our own thought processes.
And so although we've not done an integrated nuclear test in more than 30 years, the data we've gathered from each of those tests dating back to Trinity give us results that our best models, our best predictions have to validate. So there's an important balance of taking new, smaller scale data, combining those with the best models, and then using those models to explain previously acquired data, each of the 1,000 tests we did. If we could predictively explain all the nuclear tests we've ever done, including Trinity, we'd be in a very good space for understanding how the full suite of our nuclear weapons work. There is still important work to do on those frontiers today.
On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island carrying an atomic bomb codenamed Little Boy. This bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. 2 days later, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, and only hours after that declaration of war, Nagasaki, Japan was attacked. The second weapon, an imploding weapon, was codenamed Fat Man. The nuclear bombs developed by Los Alamos during World War II played a vital role in bringing Japan to the surrender table. American science helped bring World War II to an abrupt and victorious conclusion.
So to prepare for the deliverable weapons, they were already working with the B-29 crews, modifying the bomb bays and practicing airdrops. So this is going on in 1944. Even before the crisis of 44, they are preparing for the delivery of the weapons. The military, in its logistical organizational genius, had to plan for all eventualities. What happens if one of the aircraft carrying the high explosive sphere, in a mocked up combat unit? What happens if it gets shot down? What happens if a ship that's carrying Little Boy parts gets captured, right? So they had multiple ways of delivering all this equipment to the Pacific. Tinian, they had been developing that as a base very early on in the project. For redundancy purposes, they sent 3 good sets of the high explosive lenses, Fat Man 31, 32, and 33. So Little Boy also had a lot of redundant parts and combat unit casings sent to the Pacific.
My feeling about Oppenheimer during the war years is that he was acutely aware of his responsibility, both as an organizer and an administrator, also as a scientist, and also as somebody who had to help with the war effort. I don't think he felt he had a debt to the nation, but he had a responsibility to the nation. But he had to take on all these responsibilities that were going to have far-reaching ramifications, and he had to bear those almost alone and make this laboratory successful, and he did so.
So almost everything that Oppenheimer's team was taking on at a certain level continues today. What's different from then to today is the charge of what the weapon is for. So if you go back to World War II, Fat Man, Little Boy, they were not weapons of deterrence. They were weapons to end a great conflict. They were there to fight a battle. And they were fighting a battle in which the way you won wars just materially deplete your opponent. And that has evolved now to where our real principal role is to have deterrence, to try to prevent a great war. One thing that is the same that frequently gets lost in that deterrence discussion is that if you don't think of it as I can prosecute the exchange, whether it's a mad exchange or first or second strike, if you don't think through how you would prosecute and what the effects are, you also don't have a deterrent. And so in the same sense of a war-winning bomb that they had in the Manhattan projects, ours still have to be, I don't know if anyone wins, at least war ending. But the purpose of the war ending is to try to get this deterrence and stability in the world.
The success of the Manhattan Project did change the course of history. It changed war. It changed the way countries deal with conflict. One of the really interesting sort of studies that's been cited, about 15% of the population was killed due to armed conflict, either directly killed in conflict or dying as a result of disease or famine that might have been a byproduct of conflict. After the use of nuclear weapons to end the Second World War, that number was cut in half. And basically, since 1945 until today, there hasn't been an elimination of war. But what you have not seen is the kind of all-out total war, what we came to call world wars in the 20th century. And the reason is because the consequences are unthinkable. And it's why deterrence works.
J. Robert Oppenheimer has primarily been remembered for pioneering contributions to developing an atomic weapon. His incredible leadership during the Manhattan Project has left a lasting legacy.
The goal of the Manhattan Project was to take these theoretical concepts from the blackboard, right, that the theoretical physicists had come up with, and then translate that into a deliverable weapon in a bomb bay. So I like to say from blackboard to bomb bay. That is the accomplishment of the Manhattan Project. And that's part of Oppenheimer's legacy, and it's part of the legacy of Los Alamos.
There is so much to be excited about working at this laboratory right now. You have to maintain a high level of quality, a high level of understanding. One thing that's certain today, and it's as certain as it was in the Manhattan Project, if our weapons are called on to work, they will.
Too many people, I think, who don't understand the science have tried to either romanticize Oppenheimer or pillory him. There doesn't seem to be enough recognition, I think, of what he was as a scientist, as a leader, as an administrator. We see him in terms of good or bad, unfortunately, I think, in some cases. He was a scientist doing a job that the country asked him to do. I mean, I think that gets missed a lot of times. People talk about what he did, but they put moral terms on it too often, I think. And so it's good to look at him in a little different light, to say he was neither good nor bad. but changed the world.
Did Oppenheimer change the world?
Oh, absolutely. He ushered in the atomic age that we are living with, that has changed our world, that is, the physics that he was associated with as a young man has revolutionized our world, our iPhones, our communications, the artificial intelligence that we're all living with today is something that he was part of in a revolution in the 1920s and 30s. He changed the world, but he also gave us these weapons of mass destruction that may someday end the world. And he was painfully aware of that sort of dilemma and contradiction, and spent much of his life trying to think and talk and warn us about the consequences of science.
Got it now. This time, Rob, the stakes are pretty high. It's going to work all right, Robert.
Some things are too complex to understand any other way than a story. And Robert Oppenheimer's story is just so mixed up in history. We can all say, what would we have done if we were in that position? People today ask, he should have stopped the bomb from being dropped. But if you consume the story today, we can all understand that being in a position of war, having to do what you have to do during a war, feeling the duty to help contain the output of that and, put the world on a path where we didn't destroy himself, he felt responsibility for that. And I think we all have some level of responsibility. He was famously, channeled that and really felt that deeply. And I think because of the complexity of that whole set of historical facts and that he was central to it, we're still talking about him.
The challenges of deterrence in the 21st century are, if anything, much harder than what we faced at the beginning of the nuclear era, at the beginning of the Cold War. To solve problems that are, if anything, more complicated than anything we've done in the past. And so, if anything, the preservation of Oppenheimer's legacy for that future, whatever it is, I suspect is as important as any point in our history, and probably more complex than it's been, at least for a very long time.
At Los Alamos, we continue to inspire the next generation of scientists. We all want the world to be a better place. If you are a young person considering science, I would like to tell you, read about Oppenheimer, what he did, and what he encouraged his students to do. Be curious, question what you learn, try to go beyond what the textbooks are telling you, and apply your knowledge for good, so we can all together make the world a better place.
Using nuclear weapons helped end the most terrible war in human history. But they also introduced a new era, an era with great promise and a lot of uncertainty. Oppenheimer resigned from the laboratory in October 1945. He began his post-war years as a true American hero.
Once the war ends, Oppenheimer becomes a hero. In a couple different senses. He's a hero here at the laboratory because he's done something with their lives, taken their efforts, and made them a valuable contribution to ending the war. He becomes a hero to the United States. He sits on top of this mountain somewhere, and he has a specialized knowledge that only America has at this point, and he's America's son.
He played a very pivotal role after the war because he was highly sought, particularly by Congress. The military sought his advice. He became a key player in the newly developed Atomic Energy Commission. He was sought at the highest levels. The question, too, then follows, was he a hero? Yes, but clearly he sacrificed enormously to be director of the laboratory. The cost was emotional.
Hundreds of thousands of people contributed to the Manhattan Project, but Oppenheimer's name became synonymous with the effort.
The title of Father of the Atomic Bomb certainly belongs to Oppenheimer. One man did not invent the atomic bomb, one man did not build it, but one man marshaled all the forces that made it possible. So I think you have to look at the title of the Father of the Atomic Bomb in two senses. It certainly reflected his wartime work, his wartime efforts, his wartime accomplishments, but it also became a heavier and heavier mantle to bear as the years went on.
It's an interesting question. Was that a burden hit for him? I think it's this, in a funny kind of way, it's the same burden that a popular movie star has. Your life changes. You don't own your life anymore. I would have to think that was a burden. Oppenheimer must have had moments, quiet moments, where he said, my God, what have I done?
The H-bomb, McCarthyism, and the state of global political affairs changed the world Oppenheimer knew. As a result, many came to see him as the world's most famous arms control advocate during a time of rising tension.
It was clear that the success of the atomic bombs in Japan changed overnight the nature of war itself. In fact, it changed civilization. But certainly the military now saw a new approach to waging war. It changed the game. It was inevitable that the government, the military, Congress would now demand larger and bigger weapons. So at the heart of this was the development of thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb.
You have a grandstand seat here to one of the most momentous events in the history of science. You will see the most powerful explosion ever witnessed by human eyes. This is the first full-scale test of a hydrogen device. If the reaction goes, we're in the thermonuclear era.
The issue of Oppenheimer and the hydrogen bomb is very, very complex. I don't know that it's ever been truly sorted out about Oppenheimer and his feelings and his efforts. What he objected to early on was that question of whether it was really necessary or not. And by that I mean, if you've got a lot of atomic bombs, what's the point? Why did you need an H-bomb? And that did not resonate with the AEC, with the general public, and certainly with many scientists as well.
The 1950s were a very complicated time. They were shaped by post-World War II relationships, the belief on the part of the leaders of the USSR that their cause was righteous and inevitable. It caused a great deal of consternation in the United States. And Senator McCarthy capitalized on that. He saw communists under every rock. And so it was in that kind of very complicated environment in American history, very complicated time in American history, that questions about Oppenheimer grew. He got cross-threaded with some very powerful people, and it didn't go well for him.
He became less attentive to those who disagreed with him. He failed to pay attention to, despite warnings, this growing demand for a certain kind of view. He not just disagreed with his colleagues, he did it in a way that was acidic and mean. And that was a dark side of him that perhaps under the pressure and the tension of the years got to him. And that weakened him. And it also began, at that same time, began to isolate him. He began to be pushed off to the sideboard.
In 1953, the Atomic Energy Commission secretly cut off Oppenheimer's access to classified information. This marked the beginning of a tragic period in Oppenheimer's life and in the nation's history.
The hearing was supposedly a secret hearing, although overnight it became public knowledge. It was a hearing, but it was conducted by a trial. During the entire time, before the preparation for the trial and during the trial, Oppenheimer's house, his lawyers' offices were all bugged. The Atomic Energy Commission under Lewis Strauss, who was his severe opponent, knew exactly what the lawyers were going to say and Oppenheimer was going to do and how he was going to respond.
I think it was to silence Oppenheimer, to discredit him, to make it impossible for him to participate because he had so much credibility and was thought so highly of. So his opinions mattered. And Strauss and Edward Teller and others wanted to make it impossible for him to participate in the debate on the development of the hydrogen bomb, and they had to come up with some way to discredit him. And so they concocted this outrageous, these accusations that had been long since discussed and addressed and put to rest. And
you have this witch's brew of a government that's paranoid to some extent, and then a defendant who didn't know how to defend himself. But it sort of destroys him psychologically. He's never quite the same person as he was. And so he spends the rest of the time sort of in the hinterland. And the security hearings certainly contributed to these long-term decline. I think it is both mental health and physical health.
Almost from the time of the Gray hearings in 1954, there was a sense that an injustice had been done to a great American.
I had the opportunity to talk with Kai Bird, co-author of American Prometheus, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Oppenheimer, and the inspiration for Christopher Nolan's blockbuster film titled Oppenheimer. It's my understanding he wasn't offering a lot of advice to the government at that point in time. Why not just make it easy on himself?
Just before the hearing took place, Oppenheimer went in, wandered down the hall in the Institute, and went to see his friend Albert Einstein, and he told Einstein that he was going to be gone for a number of weeks, and explained why, that he was going through this security hearing and his loyalty was being questioned. And Einstein turned to him and said, "Well, Robert, you're Mr. Atomic. Why don't you just walk away? You don't need them. If they don't need you, walk away." And Robert said, no, you don't understand, Albert. I need to use my influence. I need to use my status to try to explain to the people in Washington what they need to do to control these nuclear weapons. And I need to be involved. And I can't do that without a security clearance. I can't brief the president or the Secretary of Defense without being part of this Washington establishment. He rejected Einstein's advice, and Robert Oppenheimer should have walked away. But he was politically naive. He had no idea what he was walking into, and the fact that it was all rigged and orchestrated and that he had no chance of defending himself.
He made powerful enemies who deprived him of his clearance and his dignity. But he continued to serve as the director of Princeton's Institute of Advanced Studies and as an advocate for science. On February 18, 1967, at the age of 62, J. Robert Oppenheimer passed away after battling throat cancer. One of the world's most recognized, influential, and controversial figures is laid to rest.
I think when Oppenheimer died, the world knew that somebody significant had passed from the scene. But like everybody who dies, it creates a sensation of some sort, and then all of a sudden it goes away. And so the people now who remember Oppenheimer are people like me who work in this field, scientists who owe a debt to his work, early work, and those of us, of course, who work at Los Alamos, who are direct descendants of his.
I think it gives a glimpse, especially to those of us at Los Alamos who see Oppenheimer, the Oppenheimer Fellowship. Here's the statue of Oppenheimer that, just like the rest of us, he was a person.
He was a person, and he was painfully aware of, the weaknesses of all of us, of how fragile we are. A sense of empathy that was a secret to why he was so charismatic later in life. He was painfully aware of the world and of the fragile nature of human existence.
He made his last visit to New Mexico into Los Alamos a year or two before his death. His voice was barely a whisper, and he spoke in an auditorium. And the auditorium was filled with the people, with many of them that had worked with him during the war. To him, he wasn't Oppenheimer, he was Oppie. This, I can't even go, this actually makes me emotional. Hold on, because I imagine this in my head.
Is again with us tonight. He is now director of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. But I think to him and to us, Los Alamos and he must be inexplicably intertwined. To me, and I'm sure to all of you, it is the greatest of pleasures to welcome him again to Los Alamos to speak to us tonight. Dr. Oppenheimer.
He was driven to the hill, he spoke in an auditorium, and when he approached on the stage, the audience just rose and applauded. And he gave a voice in a low whisper. He talked about Niels Bohr and what Niels Bohr represented to science and to humanity. And when he finished, the audience clapped for 10 minutes.
You almost made me forget my honor. Thank you for that wonderful welcome. And thank you, Dr. Bradbury, for what you said and all you didn't say. I'm very glad to be back. I know there are many old friends in this hall. And I know that the things that I'm going to talk about are very close to all your hearts.
The point here is not just that these were his people, the people that called him Oppie. He came back home. This, of all the places he had lived, of all the places he had visited, of all the places that he had enjoyed, he had come back to New Mexico. He had come back to the hill. He had come back home.
Oppenheimer's story doesn't end quite yet. On December 16, 2022, the Department of Energy vacated the Atomic Energy Commission's 1954 decision in the matter of J. Robert Oppenheimer. This was done, in the words of Secretary Jennifer Granholm, to correct the historical record and honor Dr. Oppenheimer's profound contributions to our national defense and the scientific enterprise at large.
After the loyalty hearings, there have been a number of efforts to kind of redress that wrong. Beginning at the time, actually, with a petition that was signed by many of the lab's staff requesting that his clearance be reinstated. And then in the early 60s, an offer was actually made to do that. He was invited to dinner at the White House and asked if he wanted his clearance reinstated. And actually he said something to the effect of, "Hell no, are you crazy?" And so instead, he was awarded the Fermi Prize, the Fermi Medal.
When they came here, they knew nothing. They didn't know where they were going. My father had just enlisted in the Army. He was then told to go home and report to Santa Fe at 109 East Palace.
Retired U.S. Senate staffer Tim Reeser spent years trying to rectify the damage caused by the security hearing.
It was both a personal thing because of my connection through my parents, but also just a matter of a travesty of justice that had been perpetrated by the government. Well, it was really thanks to Kai, who I had met many years before, who told me about the work, the efforts that he and Marty Sherwin had made previously to try to convince the Department of Energy to deal with what had happened and to recognize just how unfairly Oppenheimer had been treated and the need to rectify that. And it just sort of faded from anyone's attention other than Kai and Marty, who continued to try to find somebody who would take this on, and that's when I got involved. I decided that when President Biden was elected, that we should revisit this.
Tim is the most effective man on Capitol Hill for the last 38 years. He knows how the levers of Congress work, and he took this on and found a way to make it happen. And it's an incredible decision. I was stunned when I got a call from Tim in December saying, we did it. The Secretary of Energy is issuing a press release this afternoon. It's very rare that any government anywhere in the world will ever apologize or take back a decision. But this happened. And again, I think it sends a good message to the history books, to the young people who are going to read this story, and they'll see, well, it ended well in a way for Robert Oppenheimer. He was exonerated.
On her visit to Los Alamos, DOE Secretary Jennifer Granholm spoke about the importance of vacating the Oppenheimer hearings.
The due process component of this hearing was such a railroad, and it was clearly a decision that was made by Strauss to find the outcome they wanted, as opposed to having it be the truth. And I think it was super important for our DOE community, for our lab community, but for, to the extent that others followed this, for scientists around the country to say, to know that truth prevails and that we want scientists to openly question and to openly speak up and that we have their back.
It's nice to have a gesture like that, and it was something the family didn't advocate for as much as scientists did. In my whole life, when I met scientists, they said, we think this is really important for the scientific community, and I think that that's potentially a direct outcome of not telling scientists that your opinion doesn't matter, that your advice isn't important, and this could be a period that is going into the next stage of respect for big science and the legacy that my grandfather had. So it's painful to go through those things in the family. Robert Oppenheimer didn't complain. Really, he didn't complain about anything, and it wasn't something that we did in the family saying we demand an apology. But being given one to forgive is divine, so it's unambiguously accepted and thanked.
I reached out to my colleagues, the former directors of this lab, who'd also been contacted in many cases to write letters of support. We were absolutely unanimous that it would be entirely appropriate for the Secretary of Energy, who has the authority to do this, to basically wipe the slate clean or vacate the results of the hearing and basically apologize for the actions that were taken. He deserved better of his country, and that's what the vacation is in my mind.
Oppenheimer was such an unusual person. I hope that he would feel the same way, that, albeit awfully late in coming, been relieved that people understood that, what happened to him was really outrageous, and he was loyal, he was trustworthy, all the things that hearing attempted to discredit him for not being. In fact, he was a loyal American. He gave everything to the success of what he was asked to do. And, he did so in a way that I think everyone should feel proud of. And so, I think he would have at least been glad that his own reputation, his integrity, his loyalty were reaffirmed.
It's also important from the perspective of people today for, two maybe important points. One is that I see the Secretary's decision as sending a message to clearance holders that they can and should expect just treatment in matters of security clearances from their government, that that's a reasonable expectation and that the government holds that expectation of itself as well. I think that's an important message to people. I think there's a second message buried in there, and I think what this decision does, it does not indicate to people that even for the greats, anything less than the truth is acceptable in the security arena.
Part of Oppenheimer's legacy that's often forgotten is his laboratory. Los Alamos was created in early 1943, and it endures to this day. We continue to remember Dr. Oppenheimer here and to be inspired by the work that he did in his nation's interest during some of the most dangerous days of World War II.
It's that moment in time in which history changed in a second. Not even in a second, in a millisecond. And that millisecond that changed the world in history, not just militarily, but from now on, the world was going to have access increasingly to the power of the sun. That started here on this mesa by the people who came during the war and who even now on that hill out there are still doing the same work. That's what it matters.
And I think that the environment we have today is part of the legacy that Oppenheimer left for us. He created this environment, and it works.
The story of the diversity and the complexity of the project, I think that's something that sometimes gets lost. It seems that there's this simple timeline. You know, we thought of the weapon, we designed the weapon, we tested Trinity, somehow or another we got the weapons to the Pacific, we dropped the bombs, we ended the war. The real story is the diversity and the complexity of the project and everything that had to be done by all these people to make the project a success.
I think the first takeaway I have from Oppenheimer that I would hope people would get is that we owe him a scientific debt of gratitude, we owe him an organizational debt of gratitude, but we're here today doing this work, contributing to the nation, because of what he started and what he fostered, what he nurtured, and that has come forward in time. That legacy is ours because of his.
For those in the future, students and scientists and anyone who cares to learn about Oppenheimer and what he did and who he was, part of the story is that the government didn't just forget about what happened, and recognizing and appreciating who he was and what he contributed, and that he never should have been subjected to what happened in 1954, and that it was important to take a tangible step to make that point. It wasn't just enough to recognize it, to talk about it, to understand it. It was important to actually do something about it.
It's interesting that he was somebody who, recognized his duty during war. He didn't shirk away from that. He wasn't a total pacifist. He was interested in helping in a war and ushering technology into the world that he fully understood would be very powerful. His insight into what could be the outcome of that work. And for them, theoretical physicists, they're seeing many steps ahead. They saw that we couldn't have war in the same way. And the answer, if you understand that you can't have wars the same way, you actually would not spend a lot of time building up huge weapon systems and pointing them at each other. You would say, we're kind of forced into this new level of cooperation that we've never had before. And when he said that in kind of poetic and historical terms to leaders, I think he meant it. And he's not the only one with that insight. It's the root of all philosophy and all religions. They all say the same thing, that we have to kind of get along with people that we would have considered our enemy in the past.
It is not just nuclear weapons. The kind of discoveries within Los Alamos ranges from biology, isotopes for medical purposes, material science for structural materials. Scientists from all over the world come here at Los Alamos National Laboratory. We are unique in terms of the breadth of science that can be done in one place.
We can design and fabricate and diagnose high precision experiments in a way that was virtually inconceivable even 10 years ago. And moreover, we can simulate those experiments with a fidelity that continues to grow exponentially just by leaps and bounds and dwarfs anything that was possible even just a few years ago.
There was a huge fear that given the fact that the underlying physical principles were universally known and understood, that anyone with sufficient determination and skill could make a bomb. So we don't quite have the urgency of the Second World War. I would say there is a sense of urgency and importance to our mission that at least is a close cousin of what was present in the 1943 to 1945 period.
Oppenheimer was a complex person with a complex legacy. He faced great adversity, sometimes at his own making, but persevered. In doing so, Oppenheimer helped change the world. His science expanded our understanding of nature. His mission helped end history's most deadly war. And his legacy continues to inspire his laboratory.